Hi, welcome to the class. We'll start with fundamentals. I know sometimes fundamentals can seem a bit boring and it's tempting to skip to the fun part, but the fun part will be even more fun if you master the fundamentals right. It will be your base for the future knowledge about typography, even if you already know most of the definitions or classification methodologies. With a solid foundation, you will be able to classify a typeface or recognize their origin, understand their characteristics and what they represent. Their application will be much easier to determine. Classification will help you to combine typefaces better in the future. In the first chapter, we will cover two parts. Classification part, where I will show you how to classify typefaces based on form principles. And in fundamentals part, we'll go through few important definitions and of course the type anatomy. I will try to explain the crucial things about elements and definitions, so it will be easier to follow in the later chapters. Classification teaches us how to look at typefaces through the lens of form, history, and visual aesthetics. Font classification is not an easy task. Not because of lack of understanding by designers, but because of the different standards influenced by geographical location and language through the history. Then, with the rise of internet and web typography, classification became even more daunting task. Comparing books and modern online resources, it is yet more obvious how classification is almost everywhere different. With the rise of type foundries on the web, classification became even more simplified or just diverse. To solve this puzzle, we need to take a step back into history. Over the years, typography enthusiasts have developed various systems to define type categories and their subgroups. But broadly speaking, we can classify most typefaces into four basic groups: those with serifs, those without serifs, scripts, and decorative styles. But if we look at the historical classification, detailed distinction of serif typefaces was made by French Maximilien Vaux, where we have four main subcategories. German DIN classification puts emphasis on black letter typefaces, where we have five subcategories. And British standards put focus on sans serif typefaces, where we have four main subcategories. These three classifications follow the same structure, which is based on historic evolution of a typeface, with some subtle variations and differences. You can find these classification systems in typography history, and they are also taught in school, but in practice they are rarely used efficiently. Although the historic classification, when mastered, is quite effective, but for the most design practitioners and beginners, it makes it quite confusing. For example, what makes a fresh new typeface and an old style typeface? Or other typeface that is from 1800, a modern typeface? Different ways of naming those groups and their subgroups brings a lot of confusion. Furthermore, when we examine categorization on type foundries found online and other type resources or magazines about typography, classification is adjusted to a broader audience, so it can be easier to understand. In a way, we see more simplified terminology. These simplified main groups are categorized as serif typefaces, sans serif, slab serif, display, handwritten, and black letter. Each of these main groups have their own subgroups or subcategories with belonging typefaces. We will focus on these two main groups, serif and sans serif typefaces. We will explore their subcategories or so-called subgroups by using a different methodology of classifying compared to historical classification. Classification that is based on form of a typeface. This should give you an understanding and teach you how to classify a typeface and use it with purpose. Let's start with serif typefaces. A serif is a small shape, a feature, that appears at the beginning or at the end of the stroke on a letter. Sometimes is referred as head serif or foot serif. To further categorize serif typefaces, there are three main subgroups: dynamic, transitional, and static. As I mentioned before, classification of these subgroups of a main serif group is according to the form model, which means the names of subgroups are determined by the principles of typefaces form. The first group is called dynamic. The letter forms are open or pronounced. The contrast axis, or so-called stress, of round letters is slightly inclined to the left. Their handwritten origins are noticeable in their construction and form. The stroke contrast is usually low. However, there are typefaces with more visible stroke contrast as a part of this group. You can see the organic type serifs. The serifs are usually bracketed and sometimes asymmetrical. Here you can see calligraphic terminals because of the angled pen. The first letters were written with angled pen, and from there we have visible this construction of calligraphic terminals. Terminals are the end of the strokes. They can be serif-like in this case, or without it if typeface is sans serif. Here you can see the stress or the contrast. It's angled slightly to the left. Here are other examples of typefaces that belong to this group. Another identifier can be a lower X height compared to the other following subcategories. Also, another good identifier is that sometimes there is a slanted crossstroke on a letter E. You can see it here on this example, on this typeface. It's slightly going up, so you can recognize it there. You can see the angled stress or the contrast axis here in the letter forms and here. Here are some examples of dynamic serif typefaces, how they work in use. The second category is transitional, sometimes referred as realistic or baroque, but by the form principles, it's somewhere in between the first dynamic and the next one static. That's why it's called transitional. The stroke contrast is even stronger than in the first dynamic subgroup. The stress axis is more vertical, or sometimes it can be slightly inclined to the left. Here you can see on letter E. Serifs are bracketed and the X height is generally a bit larger. The terminals are rounded, often like small teardrops. You can see here on this example. And as I mentioned, the vertical stress is more vertical and sometimes angled. It's like a combination of two of those. Here are some type examples of those characteristics. You can see the contrast is moderate and the stress angle is varying. Let's check some examples of these transitional serif typefaces in use. And the last subcategory of serif typefaces is static, sometimes referred as rational, modern, Didone. You can see the stroke contrast is very, very clear and sometimes very extreme. Their stress angle or contrast axis is vertical. The form of the letters are quite closed. With the high stroke contrast and vertical stress, static typefaces are complete opposite of the dynamic ones that we saw in the first group. Their serifs are horizontal, thin, mainly symmetrical, and sometimes bracketed. Here you can see that they are characterized by strong vertical stroke contrast. They have a small aperture, often with this roundish terminal. The typefaces in this category are less written and more built, constant in proportion and structure. Here you can see static or sometimes called modern serif typefaces in use. Their contrast is very visible, and they are not suited for smaller sizes. Now we will go through sans serif subcategories. Sans from French meaning without. In the sans serif typefaces, there are four main subgroups or subcategories: dynamic, transitional, static, and geometric. Yes, you guessed it. The classification of subgroups is determined by the same principles of form, like with the serif typefaces. Only here we have additional subgroup that's called geometric. There are a lot of similarities with dynamic subgroups of the serif typefaces. The letter forms are open and pronounced. The stroke contrast is usually low. However, there are some typefaces with visible stroke contrast in this group. The uppercase letters, capitals, are varied with, and the leg of capital R is usually diagonal. And if you look at the letter O, it's nearly a perfect circle. These typefaces have a larger X height, so that may help with reading smaller text. The lowercase a and G are usually double story, meaning that letters have two counters. Sometimes it's open and sometimes it's closed. Here, counters are wide open. You can see the aperture here, how open it is. The term aperture describes the distance between two strokes in a character that do not enclose the interior form. Like example for in A or E, C, S. The size of aperture in a typeface influences legibility. Here are some examples. You can see that they have much lower contrast, a big X height, so they are suitable for reading from larger distance. Here you can see them in use as a running text or body text, or like headlines and some more running text. Transitional typefaces have regular proportions. The uppercase letters are of similar width. The contrast axis of round letters like O and E is vertical or slightly inclined to the left. These grotesque typefaces have relatively static forms based on the oval and very closed apertures. G often has a spur, and the X height is usually lower. When they first appeared in the early mid-1800s, they were known as the ugly, due to their rejection of elegance of historic serif styles and serif typefaces. It wasn't a style that was enjoyed by all, and because of its unattractive nature, it was labeled by some as grotesque. Here are some examples of transitional sans serif typefaces or so-called grotesque typefaces, also sometimes referred as Gothic or realistic typefaces. They may be called ugly, but definitely they have a character. Third category is static, or the new grotesque, neo-grotesque, or more rational typefaces. They have very little stroke contrast at all, with horizontal terminals here and very closed apertures. Because of their small stroke contrast and their similar forms, they are visually engaging when used as a larger size, which presents them better in a display format. Almost geometrical appearance, with very little contrast and consistent terminals. Here you can see consistent terminals, again vertical stress, single story G, that is quite common for these typefaces, and the horizontal terminals ending here and here. These fonts completely abandon the traditional characteristics to make them simpler and more minimalistic. Here are some examples of static sans serif typefaces in use. I really like their simple form and lack of contrast or very low contrast. Together with the transitional subgroup or so-called grotesque, these two are my favorite groups. And the last category is geometric typefaces or constructed typefaces constructed from simple geometric shapes. Geometric typefaces might seem simple and easy to design, but in reality, there are a lot of subtle optical adjustments to make them visually pleasing. Looking very clean, rounded, and friendly. Although forms such as the circle of the letter A seems to be perfectly round, the majority of proper typefaces don't contain perfect circles. Simple geometric shapes with optical adjustments. They have really minimal contrast and usually a single story A. That is quite common. The X height is also low. That can cause problems is if used as a body text and set in a smaller size. Here are some examples of geometric typefaces. Usually, they have been optically corrected to give the illusion that they are circular, so they harmonize well with other letter forms. Here are some examples of geometric sans serif typefaces in use. They have this structured and round look and feel. If you compare naming of subcategories in serif and sans serif groups, you can see that classification based on the form principle is much simpler. It's much easier to remember and use compared to the classification that is related to a certain style or a period in history. This way, you are always looking at the typefaces based on their form and then connecting with it other ways how they are called. Knowing how to classify typefaces, you will know about their characteristics and know what they represent. From there, it's easier to connect it with your brand or a project. Also, when going through type foundries and checking the recently published typefaces, you will slowly start to see the origin or recognize the influence on which are those typefaces built upon.